SocialStudiesGames.us, Unit 7, Video 5, as always, based on the AP History Guidelines. Today, I can compare and contrast Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, define the Great Migration, list the push-pull factors that led to the Great Migration. We're going to talk about Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, but this is a simplified explanation. And this is what you get in 4th grade social studies. And unfortunately, this is what you get according to the AP guidelines because there's so much to study. And this is not just these specific individuals, it's many of the individuals that we study throughout history. We don't necessarily anymore focus on individual biographies. We're more concerned with events and actions and bigger themes. The result of which is that we don't really go in depth into some very interesting, important figures like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. And so when we simplify things, we often exaggerate differences. And so sometimes we misconstrue this to think that, oh, W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington were the opposites and they were enemies and they did not have the same cause. That is incorrect. That is a result of simplifying our understanding of these guys because we are limited in time, but also because that's often what we do because we are limited in time. And so when you simplify people, you want to stand out, you create exaggerations, and those exaggerations have kind of taken us in different directions. So if you are interested in what you hear, if this opens the door to you for W.E.B. Du Bois or Booker T. Washington or both, then I encourage you, search the internet, many books you can find out about these guys' careers and the things that they did and the ways that they helped change society. But again, this is going to be simplified, slightly exaggerated, not the best representation, but it will be the best representation to give you an understanding of what's happening and also help you for your AP US history guidelines. Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, they will have separate plans. Again, exaggerating them, and you would really want to read a biography to find out exactly what they want to do. But for the most part, Booker T. Washington wanted to achieve equality for Black Americans or African Americans at the turn of the century. This is going into the 1910s, into the 1920s, so roughly 120-ish years ago, Booker T. Washington starting to push for equal rights for African Americans or Black Americans. We talked the other day about equal rights for women. We're now talking about Black Americans. Booker T. Washington has a different plan than what W.E.B. Du Bois will propose. Washington says, we're not going to protest. We're not going to be politically active. We're not going to demand equal rights. That's not the best way of achieving equality. That is his stance. Now, that's the 4th grade social studies, the AP guidelines, what they'll teach you in high school. The reality is he did believe in protest. That's not in your book. That's not in regular classes. He supported this, but he couldn't support this because Booker T. Washington was in control of the Tuskegee Institute. He believed in education and educating Black Americans, lifting them up, empowering them so that they had a role in the economy, so they had a role in society. But it started with education, then it moved to the economy, into federal jobs, and then into society. They would slowly, Black America would lift up and white America would have to accept Black America as equals when they noticed with their eyes and saw the result of, oh, they are equal to me. That was his plan. But in order to do that requires education, and schools cost money. And Booker T. Washington was dependent on a lot of different donors, some white donors, some donors in the Deep South. And if Booker T. Washington would have protested and supported protests, he would have lost that money. He would have lost his school. It was simply something he could not do. Underneath, secretly, he helped finance many protests. He helped finance many court cases. He did a lot to support the politically active. But we don't know about that because he could not let that be seen. He said in confidence that if he wanted to start a race war, he had the power to be politically active and start a race war the very next day. But he knew that wasn't going to help the cause, and that went against what he wanted to do in his plan for education, economic gain, and eventually proving the equality or the equalness naturally of blacks and whites, so that eventually the law would have to reflect what is actually happening. So again, he could have been politically active, but he's in a situation where he's running a school in the Deep South. Not really something that he could have done and been successful. So he doesn't do that. And what we get is the Atlanta Compromise. And this says that the Southern blacks would submit to white political rule. We'll let the whites run the local governments. We'll let the whites run the state governments. We'll let them run the federal government. They can do their government thing. As long as, we get it, you guys are in control. But what we ask is you need to guarantee that we can get an education. Again, that's a big thing with Booker T. Washington. We've got to get educated. We've got to learn math. We've got to learn science. We've got to understand civics. We have to become literate. With those tools, with that human capital that Thomas Sowell is always talking about. It's about human capital. I can give you $10,000, but it's probably not going to help you because you're going to spend it. And then when the money's gone, you're nowhere. But if you have human capital, if you have a skill, that will live with you for the rest of your life. If you can read, if you can write, if you can do advanced mathematics, if you understand science, you are going to have that for the rest of your life. That's going to open doors everywhere. When that $10,000 is gone, it's not going to open doors anymore. You can't just give money to people. But Booker T. Washington understands this. Thomas Sowell understands this, talks about this in all of his books. It's about human capital. It's not about money. People can take your money away. People can take your car away. They can take your house away. They can take your things away and they're gone. But they cannot take away your human capital, your education, your knowledge. For all that you're getting, get understanding. And Booker T. Washington understood that. We'll submit to white rule. But if we can get education and we can get due process of law, and that's basically due process is if the government takes something away, mainly your life, your liberty, your pursuit of happiness, you get a trial. You get to follow legal standing. They can't just throw people in jail. They just can't execute people. They can't just lynch people. Let us get our education and give us due process, which means a process of law. If you're proving that I'm doing something wrong, if I've been unfairly treated, I get a process. And in most cases, that's a criminal case or a criminal trial or a civil trial. Basically, it means the government can't do what, look, we're going to let the whites run the government. The white people in our country, we're going to submit and say, you can run the government. But if you're running the government, you must follow the rules. You must follow a process of law. You can't make it up as you go. That's part of the deal. We'll let you guys run the show, but let us get an education and follow the rules. Follow the process. And we guarantee that we're not going to demand equality. We're not going to fight for integration right now. And we're not going to fight for justice. We'll do our thing, although it's not necessarily fair. But we need this right now. If we get education and due process, that opens the door, that gives us an opportunity to slowly work our way towards equality. A lot of people don't like this idea by Booker T. Washington. They're like, no, you need it now. We want it now. Life is unfair. And Washington understood that, but he realized that just demanding equality, if they had equality the very next day, if the rules and the laws were all equal, Black Americans, especially in the South, didn't have the human capital to continue to grow. They still needed education. And he thought it was better to get the human capital first, then get the equality, instead of demanding it today. So again, we'll let the white rule. This is the Atlanta Compromise. Through education, African Americans will be able to fill jobs. Through jobs, African Americans or Black Americans will be able to live wherever they want, spend wherever they want, and slowly integrate themselves, as opposed to the government integrating Black America. Black America will pull itself into society instead of having the government force Black America into the society, force equality. He believes in more of a natural, organic equality where it's earned. Now, some people say you shouldn't have to earn it. Everyone should be equal. And I completely understand that. But should is often a word we shouldn't use. Sometimes things don't work the way that they're supposed to work. Booker T. Washington was a realist. He understood that racism was very strong in this nation, and that if the government tells people stop being racist, it's probably not going to happen. You may know that in your own life. If the government, if the police, if the school tells a racist to stop being racist, they're probably not going to change. And it's hard to force someone to stop being racist. But if the racist slowly realizes over time that other people are equal, then maybe that racist will change. That's Booker T. Washington's plan. It's up to you. Now, through this, eventually, then you can have activism. W.E. DuBois' plan for equality focused basically on the Niagara Movement. And it was, no, we need to demand change now. We need the government to be active. We are equal citizens. The government must protect our life, our liberty, our pursuit of happiness. Happiness. They must protect us. That's what they should do. We shouldn't be second-class citizens. And people are being lynched. Society is segregated. We can't just wait. We can't just take our time. Change the laws now, and we will continue to work and rise up. But this stuff is intolerable. We can no longer sit back idly. We must be active and tell the government now, change the law. We must be allowed to vote. We must stop the lynching. We must desegregate society. This was W.E.B. Du Bois. Different from the slow and steady, education-based, economic-based, accommodation is the name for the Booker T. Washington plan. Accommodation. That's not what W.E.B. Du Bois stands for. Eventually, the Niagara Movement will create what is called the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, still around today, a black organization, or an organization that represents black Americans in terms of civil rights, inequality, basically in any schools, any way that you can imagine. This is a very strong organization that fights for equality still today. And an example here was this organization lobbied to get the president to stop lynching and make it illegal. And so Woodrow Wilson passed a law that stopped this, but Woodrow Wilson, throw a little shade here, it's like writing history with lightning. And my only regret is that it's all so terribly true. He says this about a movie that's about the KKK. He talks about, he is a historian. He was a university president. He is a progressive. He also believed in eugenics, and he praises a movie about the KKK. Now, we'll give him one little thing before we completely destroy him. Probably one of the worst presidents ever. One thing that does it that might kind of give him a little bit of, it's tough. I mean, because he's racist. But this is the very first big time movie ever made. So, of course, he's like, yeah, it's amazing. Like, it's the first movie ever. The first D.W. Griffith's movie this is it. Movies did not exist. Full-length movies, big-time productions did not exist. It's kind of crazy that the first giant movie made in America paints the KKK as heroes. Crazy. Unbelievable. You can watch the movie online. Incredibly racist. Beyond racist. The most racist thing that you will ever see. Blackface, Ku Klux Klan. I mean, it's so horribly offensive. There's a scene where they have a black man, and you can find the clips here online. The black man, which is actually a white man with black face paint, is chasing this white woman, and they're making him look like an animal, and a crazed animal that's going to rape her. Incredibly offensive. The woman chooses to jump from a cliff and commit suicide rather than be attacked by, and I'm putting this in quotations, the beast. Terribly offensive. You can watch it online. It's almost laughable because it's so terrible. But then you realize that the president talks about, this is a great movie. Are you kidding me? The president of the United States is watching it in the White House talking about how amazing it is. That tells you about race relations and racism 120 years ago. You think it's bad today. And I know people talk about our current president. He's a racist. Okay, you can believe what you want. That is fine as long as you've got evidence to support your beliefs. You're not just calling people racist. Don't do that. If you know someone has done specific racist actions and you find them, and there probably is some stuff. If you find it, then that's fine. Label them as a racist. But this pales in comparison to Woodrow Wilson in the White House watching a KKK movie. Do you think racism is nearly as bad as it was then? We lynched people let's careful with the word we. Americans without due process lynched black Americans 120 years ago. Today, we have race problems. There is racism. We have issues, but we don't have this. Last part of our video, the Great Migration, 1960 to 1930. This is the migration of black Americans out of the South, out of the agricultural-based South, and into the North. And now today, and you'll notice they go to mainly cities. Why are they going to cities? Because that's where the jobs are. We've talked about this before in the podcast. This is not a podcast. They go to the cities because that's where the jobs are. You go to where the work is. And so today, many of these cities have large African American or black American populations. They leave the South because there aren't any jobs here. They leave the agrarian, agricultural-based South and move to the cities where the cities have industrialized, where there's factories and there's railroads and there's roads and there's automobiles. So they move from the South and go to the North. And so in your book, it's going to say that they move from the South. Let me see. Or you can look this up in the study guide. You can find the study guide at socialstudiesgames.us, where I've basically gone through the AP guidelines and given you basically the notes here. And so it says they move to the cities and then they eventually end up in ghettos and deal with racism. Sort of, kind of, but not necessarily the truth, because the reality is those cities had black populations and those cities were becoming desegregated during this time. Before the Great Migration, these cities had black populations, not large black populations, but they did have black populations, and they were slowly becoming desegregated. And we can actually, W.E.B. DuBois, we'll talk about this in a second, talks about how Philadelphia is becoming a great city to live in, and blacks are living with whites, and everything is good, and it's very equal before the Great Migration. Now, before I talk about this next maybe controversial subject, let's just remember that push-pull factors in immigration or in migration. Push factors are the things that push you out of a place, and pull factors are what pull you into a new location. Push factors, like the South, few services, lack of job opportunities is usually a big one. There wasn't very many jobs in the South because there weren't very many cities, there weren't very many factories, there were just farms, and sharecropping was not the best job in the world. You couldn't really make money. It was almost a new form of slavery, so you're being pushed out by few job opportunities, unhappiness, poor transportation. There weren't very many roads, there wasn't very many railroads in the South, so that hampered the growth of the economy. You don't really build factories when you don't have roads because you can't ship goods in and out. Not so much natural disasters. The weather in the South is just fine. Wars, we don't have to worry about that, but often throughout history, you'll see people leave countries from wars. Today, you have people leaving war-torn countries or countries that are dealing with all kinds of problems, internal strife, and then shortage of food, not really. Services, people live in the city today because there's grocery stores, there's hospitals, there are government agencies that help you out. So if you are a low-income individual, you can go down to the government agency right down the street and they will help you out. If you live in a rural area, it is very difficult to get government services in terms of food and healthcare and even education. A lot of those services are not provided. And so you get pulled to the city. The poor get pulled to the city where the government agencies are located so that they can get the resources that they need. Job opportunities, entertainment. You might move to a city someday because it's got stuff to do. Transportation, better living conditions. You want to get away from wherever you are. All right, now the controversial topic for some, maybe not others. So like I was saying before, Philadelphia, according to W.E.B. DuBois, was a great place to live, and it was doing really well. But this was all before the Great Migration. Unfortunately, and you'll see this in Thomas Sowell's book, he hypothesizes about black rednecks and white liberals. What does that mean? This sounds weird. There's no such thing as a black redneck. So black redneck culture is very similar to white redneck culture. It has its roots in England during the 1600s, 1700s. The Highland Scots, the Ulster Irish were rednecks. And these individuals were violent. It was their culture. This is over in England, by the way. They're violent, licentious. They lacked and did not support education. They were criminals. So the characteristics, the culture of the Ulster Irish and the Highland Scots, they weren't successful. They weren't educated. They struggled. Well, those individuals, when they left the United Kingdom, they left Ireland, they left Scotland, they settled in the South during the 1600s and 1700s, and they brought their culture with them. And that culture influenced Southern whites and the black slaves, and then the blacks as they were freed. The culture, and this is all hypothesized in his book and in various other books, black rednecks, white liberals, cracker culture. You even see little bits of this in Hillbilly Elegy, that the culture was violent. It didn't work very hard. And you'll see if you read the writings of Alex de Tocqueville or Frederick Law Olmsted, they all write about this while traveling through the South, that they don't really, and it's not just example like, oh, they're just lazy. They give specific examples of how the Southern whites and Southern blacks were terrible farmers and how none of the inventions came out. So all the farming before this time was in the South, but all the inventions for farming came from the North. The South could not make milk, They could not make cheese. They had Texas had all the cows. We talked about this before, but they couldn't make milk in the South because they were lazy, dumb farmers. That sounds like an exaggeration, but Frederick Law Olmsted talks about it. Alex de Tocqueville talks about it. They are shocked by the way that the Southerners live, by their culture, and how they are so different from the Northern whites and the Northern blacks, because the North was settled by England, by Germany, by a different type of people with different characteristics, with different values. The Puritans being one of the ones that jumps out of the page. They lived a different life than the Southerners. This was two different countries. A lot of times we think, oh, it's all the United States. It's not. Before the Civil War, they were called these United States, meaning that they were separate and different. And the North and the South were completely different. They were closed off. After the Great Migration, we will get blacks that move to these cities and bring with them their culture, which was violent, licentious, did not believe in education. Many were criminals. And you're going to say, this is racist. No, all of this is backed up by data and by research. And you can see this in census reports before the move. You could see that in the South, crime happened more. There was more violent crime. There was less education. You had more children born out of wedlock. You had all of these issues happening in the South. And then all those issues leave the South, move to the North, where blacks and whites were doing pretty well and prospering and becoming equal and integrated. And then it's not necessarily it's black people, it's just the culture that comes with them. This is all hypothesized in black rednecks and white liberals as why these cities turn into ghettos. They were not ghettos. There was not problems. Sure, there were issues, but not nearly like there were after the Great Migration because of the culture that they brought with them. And it's not just blacks, it's whites as well. You can read stories of the whites that moved from Appalachia up to cities in Ohio and Michigan. This is J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy talks about this, how the whites up here did not want the Southern whites moving up because they were violent, they were criminals, they were aggressive, they didn't believe in education. If you insulted them, they wanted to shoot you. They lacked a culture of dignity. They were about the culture of honor. You can read about that from Jonathan Haidt. You can read about that in Malcolm Gladwell. There are books and books and books that support this theory. Why we don't talk about it, it's because anytime we ever talk about anything that involves race, people just say, you're a racist. Well, we've got books and books and books over the last 300 years that says, well, there was this culture in the South. And it's not a black culture. It's not a white culture. It's actually a culture that came from Ireland and from Scotland. The accent, the urban accent that is used, which some people call ebonics or whichever you want to use, ghetto slang, the way that we speak or the way that the black redneck spoke was actually from the Scottish. It's actually from the Ulster Irish. That's where these things come from. It's very interesting and worth studying. But of course, when you say that, someone's probably already saying, this guy's a racist. I am not a racist. This is a hypothesis that kind of explains what might have happened. Maybe it's not right and more research needs to happen. But it seems like there's a lot of compelling evidence that there was a culture that came with to the North that caused the ghettos to form, because the ghettos weren't there before. So when they moved, unfortunately, we always say, oh, they moved, they just moved to another ghetto. They didn't move to another ghetto. The ghetto was formed when the migration happened. And then a lot of times, oh, it's just straight racism. Well, it is racism, but there wasn't racism before, at least to that extent. The racism did occur, but the racism happened because of the culture that was brought with them. So compare and contrast Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois. Remember that we've kind of exaggerated their differences. One was more politically active. One believed in education. That's a simple answer. The Great Migration is the move of black Americans to the North in northern cities, 1960 to 1930. That's a simple answer. If you really want to dig deep into the work of Thomas Sowell, Malcolm Gladwell, J.D. Vance, Alex de Tocqueville, all the names of people that you can research to find out if what I'm saying is true, there's tons of research that you can dive into and find out, oh, maybe there is a little bit of truth there. And then push-pull factors, the things that push you out of where you're living, the things that pull you in and say, I want to go live in that place. Thanks for joining me, guys.